Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for another lunchtime community open house. We'll keep this pretty casual, but Taz, did you want to kick it off?
Yeah, so folks, thanks for joining us. As Anya mentioned, this is really intended to be a very casual discussion about the ongoing work that we're doing with the missing middle proposals for Chapel Hill. We'll get things started with just a very brief presentation that Anya will walk us through. The goal of that presentation is really just to give, again, a very brief discussion of the kind of broad contours of the proposal. And then we want to spend the majority of the hour going through questions or concerns that y'all might have about the proposal. So with that, Anya, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if you want me to host the presentation. And then
Sure, or I can do it. It's just if mine freezes that.
Okay, yeah.
You'll be my backup if that's okay.
Go for it.
Okay. Okay, do we have it in full screen?
I'm not seeing your presentation. Now I'm seeing your presentation. Okay.
Okay, and it looks good?
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Taz. So again, we're here today to talk about the housing choices for a complete community. Here is our schedule, and I realize that we probably should update it because most of the dates are in the past. But we know you've heard a lot about February 22nd being a key date, and we just wanted to point out that while we are taking this to council next week, our goal is really to give council an update and then sort of take a pause on this and repivot based on all the meaningful community feedback that we've received. And so Taz and I will continue to meet with the different neighborhood groups during March, well, February, March, and then probably even into April. And so we've tentatively scheduled a work session with the town council in April to get some feedback and direction on where they would like us to go next, and then potentially bringing back something in May for the council to reopen a public hearing. So we get asked a lot about why are we doing this, and so this stemmed in part from several council members petitioning the staff to create pathways for missing middle housing. And that was something that they submitted to the planning department back in September of 2021. From there, we had a projected housing needs study that found that we needed about 500 new units of housing each year just to keep up with demand. And of that, I think about 40 units was geared for student housing demand, and the rest, so about 460 units, were needed for individual households. And then we have our complete community strategy that's been ongoing, and that is also calling for a more diversity in our housing types. Chapel Hill has been very good about building single-family detached residences, as well as these new apartment complexes, but we're not building a lot in between, and so that's leaving a lot of folks behind. And I will point out, if we haven't already, we will put the project webpage in the chat so that you have a link to it. And these items, the council petition, the housing study, and even links to complete communities, I think are all available on our web pages. So the text amendments are really in two buckets. So very briefly, the first bucket is just updating some setback and height exceptions in the code, making sure that we have definitions and development standards for townhouses, because that doesn't currently exist in the code and it causes a lot of confusion. And then there's also a lot of information about duplexes and accessory apartments that we feel like is buried in the definitions and really should be part of the main land use management ordinance. So those are really like cleanup items. And then this part that you're probably more interested in are these opportunities to increase missing middle housing. And so with these, we are adding in definitions and development standards for triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage courts. We recognize that duplexes and accessory apartments are also forms of missing middle housing, but those forms are also currently addressed in the LUMO. The LUMO doesn't address as explicitly the triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage courts. Under the current proposal, these would be allowed in most zoning districts. In a minute, we'll talk a little bit about how we propose to remove the density limitations. And then under the current proposal, it's proposed that triplexes and fourplexes would be approved administratively, just like single family development is. So when we're talking about missing middle housing, through a zoning lens, we do not have the ability to control income or rent levels. And so for that reason, missing middle to us is really about the form. And so we're thinking of it as a diversity of housing types, such as duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. We're calling it a cottage court. They're calling it a bungalow court, but they're roughly the same. We also want to make sure that we're putting in some barriers to make sure that this is gentle densification. So we want to increase density slowly. We don't want this to be something that we see a massive growth out of immediately. We want to make sure that we have time to watch it grow incrementally. So again, the purpose of the text amendment is really to clean up the LUMO, diversify housing types, increase housing production, encourage compatible infill development. And so if you've reviewed some of our materials, you'll see that the draft ordinance that we initially presented to council had a whole section in it about neighborhood compatibility. So really making sure that if you build a missing middle housing type, that it fits in with the neighborhood, that it uses the same materials, roof pitches, facade widths, similar heights, all of those things that really kind of define what the neighborhood context is. And then we want to make sure that we're strategically and sensitively increasing density. And so currently the land use management ordinance has a column in the dimensional standards table that defines density based on the number of units per acre. And so we think there's other ways and better ways to define density. And so instead of defining it by units per acre, we can really use the existing development standards that we have, like lot sizes, setbacks, building dimensions, floor area ratio, to control how big a building can be on an existing lot. And so you can see where you can take the same square and divide it up into different ways to create more units. So like here's a duplex, here's an example of fourplexes. On top here are all the different residential zoning districts. And then these are the proposed uses. And so where you see a use is underlined, that means it's a new definition in the code. Where we've shown that it's P for permitted, that would be something that's already permitted under today's code. And if the P is underlined, that means that it's we're proposing that it be permitted in that zone. So very quickly, we have three types that we're proposing. The first one is this cottage on a compact lot. We've heard from Durham that there's still a lot of demand for single family detached housing. And so what they did was they created this small house on a small lot option, which allowed people to build much smaller single family homes on smaller lots, but that they still were detached homes and helped meet some of the housing needs. And so in this case, the minimum lot size would be 2,700 square feet. It would have some reduced interior street and interior setbacks. And then just like single family houses, it would have an impervious surface of 0.5. Again, the height, the maximum unit size, all of that is much smaller to make sure that this type of housing stays small. The next one is the triplex and fourplex. And so again, a lot of this is going to follow the underlying zoning as far as height, lot width, street setback, interior setbacks. But if it's being built in a neighborhood that's has been existed for 20 years or more, then those neighborhood context standards would apply. And making sure then that like the materials, the window patterns, the massing, all that is more consistent with what's already existing in the neighborhood. Currently, single family developments do not have any tree canopy coverage requirement. I know most residential lots do have a lot of tree canopy on them, but you could clear cut that today and we can't stop you. And so under the current proposal, I believe we've proposed 20% tree canopy. The number of parking spaces required would follow the multifamily regulations based on the number of bedrooms. And then much like single family, we're saying it can only have an impervious surface of 0.5 or 50%. Currently, if you were to build multifamily, you could have impervious surface up to 0.75 or 75% of the lot. So this is actually reduced again in an effort to make it more compatible with neighboring single family development. And then again, we're trying to keep the unit sizes much smaller to keep that mass down and to keep the units smaller and more compatible with like a single family home size. And then this last one is the cottage courts, and this would be 6 to 12 of these little cottages around a landscaped area with some parking in the back. So you can kind of see on this example. The setbacks would largely follow the zoning. The tree canopy coverage we're proposing to be 30%. And then the parking, depending on which zoning district you're in, would be about 1 to 2 vehicle spaces per dwelling unit in these cottages. And then we've provided some building dimensional standards here. Because again, we want to make sure that the cottages stay smaller, that these are not meant to be large homes, that they're supposed to be not necessarily a tiny home, but roughly 500 to 1,600 square feet in size, that they're pretty small. So with that, and then the last one is townhomes, and that again fits more into that first bucket that I showed you, where we want to provide a definition because one does not exist now. So let me stop sharing, and Taz and I can try to answer your questions.
Yeah, so folks, for those attending, you should see a raise hand feature on the Zoom call. If you have a question or even just a comment, some constructive criticism or otherwise, feel free to use that raise hand feature, and we can bring you in to hear from you. One question I'd love to pose to the group is how you heard about today's meeting. We are very much trying to make sure that we're reaching out to folks in multiple different ways, and want to make sure that we're being effective with that. So if we could, love to hear how folks heard about today, how they would like to stay informed for future meetings of this sort.
Well, we're working on getting it so that I can, oh, great, we have a question.
Oh, perfect. Tina, I will thank you for raising your hand, Tina. I'm going to go ahead and bring you in so you can share your thoughts. Oh, wait, I can't bring you in. Anya, do you have the authority to do that?
Let me try. Let's see. Yes.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for having this. Great illustrations. I guess I have I'm curious about the potential inadvertent consequences of increasing costs or land values for surrounding properties. I've seen some of the work in Durham where they've maybe there's been an existing single family home that's been demolished and replaced by a court of maybe 6 to 8, sometimes three to maybe 8 homes. And those homes, the cost of those homes are probably equal or more than the surrounding homes, and how what that is essentially doing is making that particular piece of property much higher in cost percentage wise than surrounding properties. And I'm just wondering if you've thought about that, and maybe you've heard from Durham on what their experience has been. But I know in some of the older neighborhoods in Durham, I think there's some concerns from existing neighbors that design, even whether they like the look of it or not, may have some effects of bumping some existing residents out because it's going to increase land costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not something that Durham, in the work that they've done so far, has found is a significant issue. I don't know that they have run across that, at least from the planning department's perspective. It is something we've thought about. We've heard the concern from folks. We've had conversations with the Orange County Tax Administrator's Office to understand their perspective on how these changes could be factored in. and it's difficult for them to forecast, right? Because their tax reassessment cycle, they're on a 4-year cycle to reassess properties, and what they're looking for is primarily data around sales, right? And then trying to unpack what factors led to the sales prices that they're seeing. So it is something that we're mindful of. I know the town has, obviously no say in assessed tax value, but the town does have control over the tax rate. And so that is one lever that the town has it at its disposal. If it does appear that there are runaway unintended consequences, there are tools that the town has to address those.
Thanks, Tina. Those are good questions. I just wanted to let everybody know I put in the chat both the link to our project website that includes the calendar of upcoming events. There's a list of neighborhood meetings that we've scheduled as well. And then I also included the public input page. There is a link to that from the project webpage, but the public input page has some additional information. It also there's a feature on there for a survey, and I think there might even be a feature for folks that are interested to sign up for email notifications. Okay, so Phil Lyons looks like he was the next one, and then Chris Burnt, I'm also going to bring you in. Phil.
Hi. I believe I heard for the first time Anya mentioning something about building in a mechanism to make sure that there is no rush to build. Could you explain more about that, and I'll go back to me.
Sure. Taz, I noticed you're unmuted. Did you want to do it, or do you want me to talk about it?
I'm happy to talk about it. So Phil, there's a couple of mechanisms that, and I think we're talking about the same thing here, that there's a couple of mechanisms that we haven't committed to anything yet, but we're kind of kicking around ideas as we keep improving the proposal. One thing that is certainly a possibility would be some sort of minimum separation requirement between similar housing types, right? So, for example, we've heard from a lot of neighborhoods that they're concerned about the possibility of a developer coming in and buying up multiple properties on the same street, and then taking advantage of these new housing opportunities to really kind of make wholesale and fast changes to the fabric of one street, right? And so one of the ways we could prevent something like that from happening would be to say that fourplexes, right, new fourplexes could not be located on adjacent lots. That could also be strengthened to be a distance-based requirement rather than just an adjacency requirement, right? So we could have, whatever the final value ends up being, but it could be 100 feet, 200 feet between permitted fourplexes or triplexes. So again, those are one way that we could kind of reduce the development pressure. There's also opportunities to do something like an annual limit on the number of new permits that would be issued for some of these new missing middle housing types. So again, those are a couple of examples of the types of mechanisms that could be included moving forward.
May I ask one more question?
Please.
Thank you. Do you intend to summarize some of the changes, or maybe some would consider alterations. I hesitate to say improvements, but alterations that you have made to the proposal over time. Will that go before council, or will there be a document to that effect? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So tentatively, we're proposing to go back to the council for a work session in April, and I think that's when you're going to see us presenting a lot of these different options to get some council feedback on it.
That's all for me.
Thanks. Hey, Chris.
Good morning. I had a question about your research on the restrictive covenants and how that's coming and what's the status. And I have another question later. So do you have information for us on your research on restrictive covenants and what neighborhoods they apply in?
Yeah, I mean, it is it's work that we've looked into. I think it's because of the nature of the work, it's really hard to say with any high level of confidence, you know, in anything looking like, you know, an authoritative manner that, you know, X neighborhood definitely does or doesn't have covenants. I think we know some of the broad parameters that would suggest that a neighborhood has covenants, like the age of the neighborhood. Generally speaking, neighborhoods that were created after the 60s or so are very likely to have covenants. But again, it's just something that it's very difficult, and we've been trying to understand what we can and can't do. And it's very difficult to say with a high level of confidence that any particular neighborhood does or doesn't have covenants that are still enforceable and still on the books.
So how will that all end up then? Will it be up to the neighborhoods to figure that out, or I just wonder?
Yeah, I mean, the one obviously the fallback, or not the fallback, but the ultimate, you know, relationship between zoning and covenants is that covenants are ultimately private contractual obligations and relationships between neighbors, right? The town has never played a role in enforcing covenants, and the Building and Development Services Department has never, you know, before they issue a permit to build something, they don't and they have never asked an applicant to show that what they're asking the town permission to do is allowed under the covenants that may or may not exist for that property. So
Right.
The town's enforcement is really covenant agnostic, and so yeah, it would really be a private matter for whoever's trying to build on a particular piece of property. One of their obligations would be to know what they can or can't do based on the covenants for that property.
So will you have information for the council at their April work session on your research?
I think we'll be able to tell them what we do or don't know. I don't know exactly what that will be at that time.
Okay.
I just want to add, we are very interested in this question. We certainly share the interest a lot of community members have in knowing how exactly covenants could interplay with zoning to affect these reforms. We've just been getting guidance that really cautions around things that venture into the realm of legal research and title searches, where saying anything with accuracy goes beyond what we can do as staff and what we can do as planners. So I think, Taz was talking about some general ways you might be able to characterize where covenants exist, such as age of neighborhood and what that might mean geographically. But we're going to be very mindful about not stating anything coming across as certain as to whether a neighborhood does or does not have covenants that apply, what the boundaries of the covenants are. It's just beyond what we've been able to pull together with accuracy. But we do plan to share information with the council in more general terms about how covenants interplay with zoning in Chapel Hill.
Thank you. My other question was about our historic districts. Has there been any additional thinking on that and how the ordinance may or may not apply in areas that we have said as a community that we want to protect? and
Mhm.
preserve?
So staff has been talking to Preservation North Carolina and the State Historic Preservation Office about it. We've been reading through some of the publications from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I think a lot of it just boils down to really looking at the character of our historic districts. If you go over to Cameron McCauley, there's some examples of some historic duplexes and cottage, even a couple like little cottage courts and things that cropped up after World War II. Franklin Rosemary, I think, tended to see more single family homes, and then obviously Gimgle is only single family homes. And so we've been talking about different strategies and discussions based on some of the comments that we heard from the Franklin Rosemary, excuse me, residents last week. And I know Preservation Chapel Hill has also come out and said that this is not a good fit for those historic districts. And I don't want to speak for Preservation Chapel Hill. So
at the beginning, did you say you talked to Preservation North Carolina as well?
Yep.
And their advice was about trying to look at the character of neighborhoods?
Yes.
And so presumably design standards would do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can look at it a few ways. I mean, I think, there's from the zoning perspective, we're trying to make sure that we propose some neighborhood context standards that will apply generally whenever you're building within an established neighborhood. And then because it's in the historic district, you also have the historic district design principles and standards, and that certificate of appropriateness process that allows the Historic District Commission to review any proposals.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, it's 12:30 and we appreciate all the questions. I can put my email and Taz's in the chat. So if anybody thinks of anything else, you're welcome to email us. Taz, is there anything else you think we should chat about?
No, I think we're good. If folks don't have any additional questions.
And I would just encourage everybody to continue to look at that project webpage. We're continuously adding to the frequently asked questions page. And if there's any upcoming events or new events that are scheduled, we'll be putting it on there. Great.
Well, thank
you,
everybody.
everybody.